Hello my dear students. In this tutorial we will learn that what is the necessary of finally block in try catch blocks. Now to understand that, first we need to understand that why we even required a finally block, and to get an idea the requirement of the finally block, let's look at the code snippet. Here we have a class called main where we have a regular method which is f. Now this method f takes an integer value and it will going to give you an output of x divided by x module 5. So basically whatever integer value we pass to that particular method, it will take the mod value with 5 of that x and divide that value from x. Under the main class there is our regular main method present, and it will take the value of x from the command line, and as from the command line we are passing an integer value and a string value, so we will take we will call the person method under the integer class to convert that string value to the corresponding integer. And as method f is a non-static method, so we require an object of main class, and therefore we are creating an object of main class. With the help of that object we are just calling the f function, and finally I put my signature in the end. So what happen if we try to execute the code in various way? So let us now look at the output closely. Now as you can see, at the very beginning we try to execute that code as java main, and that leads to an exception which is array bound index out of bound exception, because there is nothing in the index 0. Now when we try to execute the same code by passing 10, then in args 0 the value is the string 10, and at line number 6 the integer x is now initialized by integer 10 through this person method. In line number 7 we are basically passing 10 because x is assigned as 10. So from line number 7 now Java tries to execute the void f function. At line number 3 it gets an exception. Why? Because the value of x here is 10 and 10 mod 5 is basically 0. So basically at line number 3 Java tries to execute an instruction which is system.out.println 10 divided by 0, which creates an object of arithmetic exception. So here we have an arithmetic exception, the cause of the arithmetic exception from line number 3, and it hampers the line number 7 as well. Now when we try to execute the same code with one as a string, we are very much getting the number format exception, because the person method cannot able to change that 1 to numeric 1. Now finally when we pass 1 in command line argument, our code runs successfully and we have 1 and then my signature as an output. Now how to handle that exception? Well, we already know how to handle it, so we will bring try catch block. So if we bring the try catch block, we are very much able to handle the exception at or for Java main, for Java main 10 and for Java main 1, and for Java main 1 in numeric we will get the proper output. Now just focus on line number 9. What is the purpose of that instruction? Now let us assume that this code is written by me, so no matter there is an exception or not, I would like to print this particular line for sure. That means if there is any exception in try, still I will get my signature as an output. If there is no exception in the try, still I want to get my signature as an output. So using try catch block we cannot do that. So how to do it? So before going into the code, at this point let's understand what is a finally block is. So finally block always executes when the try block exists. Means, as we have seen in try catch block or try catch ladder, if there is any exception within the try, then only the catch block will be executed. But if there is no exception, catch block never execute. But that is not in case of finally. Finally assure that no matter whether there is any exception within try block or not, the codes or the instructions under the finally block will get executed for sure. That means finally blocks basically do not depends on the exception. Rather, we used to put the cleanup code in the finally block, which helps if there is any unwanted or unexpected exception occurs during the execution. So that is the main purpose of the finally block. So if we now check the flow of the execution in finally block, it goes as follows. We have a try block where under this try block we have all the instruction. Now if there is any exception never occurred, then the finally block will get executed for sure. What if there is any exception? Well, then try block will check whether there is any corresponding catch block or not which can handle that type of exception. If we have a supporting catch block, then catch block will handle that exception, and after that the finally block will get executed. But what if there is no such catch block? Well, the exception is unhandled, but still finally block will get executed for sure. So that is the process flow of finally block. Now let us understand that process flow with a code snippet. Now it is exactly the previous code with a minor change. Here we basically bring the finally block here and we put our main instruction which we want to execute irrespective of there is any exception occurred or not in the finally block. So as far as the definition of the finally block is concerned, now that my signature output we should get no matter whether there is any exception or not. So let's now look at the output. Here when we try to execute the code as Java main, the exception is there, which is an array index out of bound exception. But you can see that this my signature output we are getting, but in the previous case we are lacking that my signature. So what exactly happened? So when we try to run that code as Java main, at line number 7 there is an exception occurred. Why? Because there is no such index called args 0. So whenever there is an exception occurred, Java immediately jumps to the catch block from that line. So from line number 7 to Java jumps to line number 10, and under that catch block the line number 11 will get executed, and therefore we are getting an exception has occurred and the object says it's an array index out of bound exception. Now what happened next is, after the exception has been handled within the catch block, it then comes to finally block, and finally the line number 14 get executed, and therefore we are getting that output my signature. So that's why we call that block as finally. That means when everything is over, finally we must, or we can say Java must execute that instructions which is under finally block. When we try to execute the same code as Java main 10, just as previous we are facing arithmetic exception, and just as previous the process flow goes. From the arithmetic exception we have the catch block where we handle the exception, but still the finally block get executed. For Java main ONE1 the same thing happened. Now let's focus on Java main numeric 1. It's very interesting. Here we have no exception within the try block. So even if there is no exception within the try block, still finally assure that our code will get executed. So that is the unique feature of the finally block. As I told you before, that no matter whether there is any exception or not within the try block, finally block will get executed for sure. Now at that point, for finally, or whatever the instruction we are putting under the finally, what we can say that for finally block, what actually irrelevant? Well, you are right. The actual irrelevant thing here is the exception. Why? Because within the try block, if there is any exception or not, finally block will execute for sure. That means finally block has nothing to do with the exception. So what if we don't even want to handle the exception? So in such case, can finally works? Because finally focus on those codes which are essential to execute no matter whether there is any exception occurred or not, and that makes exceptions are irrelevant for finally block. So can we do that? Can we omit the catch block and still we can expect that finally block will be executed? Okay, let's see in the very next code. Now in the next code snippet, we just upgrade the code and we omit the catch block from the code. So here, if we call or if we try to execute the code with Java main or Java main 10 or Java main ONE1, in all cases we can expect the exceptions. So what happened? to the finally block. Let's see. Interesting, right? Well, here we have a little more different output. In this case, we get the output of the finally block first and then the exceptions. So in all three cases, here first we get the output of the finally block and then we are having the exceptions. Why so? Well, let's look at the fast execution. So when we try to execute the code as Java main, we are having an array index out of bounds exception for index 0, just as previous. Now what happened next? So whenever we have the array index out of bounds exception in line number 7, which is here, the Java creates an object of array index out of bounds exception. Now who is going to deal with that exception? Did we put any catch block to handle that exception? Unfortunately, no. So who is going to handle that exception? Yes, you're right. The default handler will going to handle that exception. Now when default handler takes its place, when everybody fails, then default handler handles the exception and eventually the code gets stopped. Now if the code gets stopped, can we revert back to the finally block? Well, no. So in that case, whenever we have an exceptions object, before default handler going to get or going to handle that exception, as there is no catch block, so from the try block it first comes to the finally block and we have the output for the finally block, or the instructions under the finally block get executed, and then it will, or the default handler will deals with the exception. So this is what happened in case we remove the catch block from the try, catch and finally ladder. So now you can understand that for 10 why we get this output, for 1 why we are getting this output. So in all the cases where there is an exception, first the instruction within the finally block get executed and then finally default handler takes its charge and deals with the exception. So this is the default handler's job. Here this is the default handler job. Here this is the default handler job. And if there is no exception, it is as good or as same as the previous one. So if we now go back to the previous code, here all the exceptions are basically deals by the own catch block, own catch block, own catch block, own catch block. That's why we are getting an exception has occurred this string first and followed by the exceptions object. So the process flow basically try, then the own catch block, then the finally block, and finally the default handler. So now we can wrap up everything, like if there is an exception in the try block, it will go and find for supporting catch block which can able to handle that particular exception. If system finds such catch block, then the exception is been handled within that catch block, and finally within the finally block the instructions get executed. Now if system won't find any supporting catch blocks or system won't finds any catch block at all, that means the exception remains unhandled. So before going into the default handler, first the associated finally block with the try will get executed, and then the default handler takes his charge and handle that unhandled exception which has been thrown from the try block. So this is all about the try catch finally ladder. So we can say a try block can works either with catch blocks or with finally blocks or with both, but a try block required at least either a catch block or a finally block, whereas a catch block cannot work alone. Catch block always required a try block. Similarly, finally block also always required a try block. Now if we look at the try catch finally ladder, can we put finally block before the try block? No, we can't, because finally should be the last statement when everything, or in terms of exception, when all the exception either has been handled or unhandled, finally we will get the get the finally block, and finally system will executes the instruction within the finally block. So finally block should be in the last statement. So if you create a ladder with try catch finally, you should put finally at the end of that ladder. So this is all about the try catch and finally. If you have any queries or any doubts or any further explanation, then please put your doubts or query in the comment section. Thank you.